Father in heaven, as we study this vitally important topic, I just pray for your Spirit's guidance. Please open our hearts and minds to receive what you want to teach us. Clear away our clouded vision that obscures our understanding of your beautiful plan. Help us to understand the attacks of the enemy and what we can do to work against it, Lord. Please speak through me. May this message be clear, and I ask in Jesus' name, amen. All right, we're going to talk about a lot of science this afternoon, and I want to start with a statement that we have in the Spirit of Prophecy that is one that perhaps many of us are familiar with, or perhaps we've heard variations upon it. I've heard it quoted erroneously in various paraphrases, but I want to look at it, and we're going to look at the modern science now as to why it is true, because it's something that we have often dismissed as perhaps a little bit old-fashioned at times. But we are told parents should be the only teachers of their children until they have reached 8 or 10 years of age. As fast as their minds can comprehend it, the parents should open before them God's great book of nature. Now, there's more to read here, but I want to pause right here. First of all, we're looking at a program of education for children until what age? Okay, 8 or 10. So we're talking about a program of education in the first 8 or 10 years of a child's life. And there are two components that are mentioned here. It first of all tells us who the teachers should be. Who should that be? Parents, okay. And then it says what the textbook should be. What was that? What is it? Nature, all right. The parents should open before them God's great book of nature. Now, where should the classroom be? Because sometimes you think, okay, book of nature, we're going to get some textbooks from National Geographic, and that's not the book of nature. That's learning from a book about the book of nature. Continuing, same quote here. The only schoolroom for children until 8 or 10 years of age should be in the open air amid the opening flowers and nature's beautiful scenery and their most familiar textbook, The Treasures of Nature. So there it says it again, the textbook should be The Treasures of Nature. So we're talking about a program of education. This is a curriculum, if you will, for children up until the ages of 8 or 10. The teachers should be the parents, the textbook should be nature, and the schoolroom should be the open air. Now, does that sound like your traditional kindergarten program these days? A far cry from it, right? So we've tended to kind of look at that and say, well, that was written 100 some years ago. I think we have some improved methods now. Maybe it doesn't quite apply. You've probably heard some statements like that about that. I want to turn to the science. Now, we don't need the science to prove God correct, do we? But it helps strengthen our faith. And we're going to see how absolutely correct this statement is and how it affects. Some of you may be saying, well, I don't really have young children. Does this apply? I guarantee, as I've talked with even older people who say, aha, that's why I've experienced this, that, and various, difficulties in learning or in school or in life in general. This affects so much. Those first years of life affect so much of later adulthood. So it's a fascinating topic, but there's a lot of research to get into. Now, this morning we were going through thought-destroying tactics of Satan, things that were damaging good thinking abilities. We saw a lack of physical activity. We saw testing. Talked about the health message, practical work. And the last one on the list, I just left a question mark because I wanted to focus in on it this afternoon. And it is what we would call early formal academics, or we could say early schooling. But it is not only sending a child to school, it's also just doing the wrong kind of education, even if it is at home. You can have as I was talking to someone just last week, they said, I did homeschooling, but that wasn't true education. And so there is a difference there. And so that's why I've defined this as early formal academics. This is a type of education that is not healthy at an early age. But just for, again, to contrast and to look at the way traditional education is functioning, they did a study. The study was titled, Is Kindergarten the New First Grade? And they were looking at how the academic pressure has been increasing at an earlier and earlier age in school. And some of the older generation here would be shocked to know what is actually happening in kindergarten today and what the emphasis and the focus is. So they compared kindergarten classrooms in 1998 with classrooms in 2010. They asked kindergarten teachers in 1998, is reading fluently too much to expect out of a kindergartner? Now, what would be the answer? I would say so. That's a bit much to expect. Well, about 50% of kindergarten teachers said, yeah, that would be too much to expect out of a kindergartner. 12 years later, in 2010, they asked the same question. Now, it was only 10% felt that that was too much to ask. Again, I'm just talking about how our perceptions have changed about what to expect during early childhood education. In 1998, 29% of kindergarten teachers said that children should learn to read in kindergarten. 12 years later, that figure had gone up to 78%. In 1998, around half of kindergartners were in full-day programs. 2010, 81% in full-day programs. Along with this, the time for art and music and hands-on projects has dwindled. With 90% in 2010, 90% of kindergartners were being taught to read. 97% were in classes where composing and writing complete sentences was a needed skill. And 99% were learning capitalization and punctuation. This is kindergarten. Things have changed. Our emphasis has changed a lot. Now, don't get stuck on the numbers. I'm not saying this is the case in every kindergarten, everywhere, but what I'm illustrating is a shift in our perceptions and what we're expecting and what we're focusing on in the early childhood education programs. School districts today report a more structured kindergarten program that centers on specific academic objectives and emulates what once was a grade 1 focus. So we keep shifting. It used to be second grade, and then it was first grade, and now it's kindergarten, and we keep pressuring the academics earlier and earlier. And we see this politically. Kindergarten, since the 1980s, has become increasingly academic, with big pushes from President George Bush's No Child Left Behind and President Obama's Race to the Top. And today, children are being asked to do things they are not ready to do. Then we have legislation involved. Under the Common Core standards, the snowball has escalated into an avalanche which threatens to destroy appropriate and effective approaches to early education. The kindergarten standards, in use in over 40 states, place huge emphasis on print literacy and state bluntly that by the end of kindergarten, children are to read emergent reader text with purpose and understanding. We've seen a huge push for reading at a very early age. The Journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics clinical report found that an increasing societal focus on academic readiness has led to a focus on structured activities that are designed to promote academic results as early as preschool, with a corresponding decrease in playful learning. Meanwhile, 30% of U.S. kindergarten children no longer have recess. I'm like, this isn't university we're talking about here. Kindergarten, they don't even have recess. Now, I just want us to think, we talked earlier this morning about the attack, the intentional focus on getting kids through this system that is designed to make them not think. It's no accident that this is happening earlier and earlier and earlier, getting them into that system as early as possible. 5 and 6-year-olds are being asked to sit doing math, reading, and writing for hours at a time, sometimes with no recess or a very short one. Some teachers have dispensed with snacks during half-day kindergarten because there just isn't any time. Many kindergartners take home homework every day. Notice the title there of this article, Sweatshop Kindergarten. It's maddening. There was a comment on this article that said, I am a teacher and I work with kindergarten students. The biggest downfall to kindergarten, as I see it, is that academics have to start on day 1 so that there will be time to get through the curriculum and complete the mandated assessments. Teachers are under so much pressure that they feel they cannot take the time needed to teach any skills other than the academic ones. It's beyond frustrating when we see students struggling and we know the reasons why, but pressure from above prevents us from being able to address the problems. It's maddening. Teacher-led instruction in kindergarten has almost entirely replaced the active play-based experiential learning that we know children need from decades of research in cognitive and developmental psychology and neuroscience. And this is just a sampling, and this is just an illustration of the shift we've seen in early childhood education and what we're expecting out of them. But I don't want us to entirely point the fingers at the school systems, because sometimes we tend to repeat the same mistakes even if we are homeschooling. Now, homeschooling is certainly an improvement, but as I mentioned, we're not just talking about sending the children to school, we're talking about what we are teaching them during those first 8 to 10 years of life, because it was not only that the parent should be the only teacher, but it also identified what the curriculum should be, right? Study of nature and spending time outdoors. So, while a lot of administrators and parents and teachers are thrilled with these changes in kindergarten, there is a significant body of scientific research that is telling us very clearly that they're not quite ready yet, and we're actually doing a lot of damage in the process. One article talking about what age children are ready for school said there is no research evidence to support the claims that earlier is better. And I can't stress that enough. We're going to see a lot of the research, but it just really boils down to that. There is no research evidence showing us that all this pressure for academics at an early age is benefiting children. It just doesn't exist. By contrast, a considerable body of evidence clearly indicates the crucial importance of play, and we could add to that from the Spirit of Prophecy, useful work, practical tasks, in young children's development, the value of an extended period of playful learning before the start of formal schooling, and the damaging consequences of starting the formal learning of literacy and numeracy too young. So with that introduction, let's get into the science of how this actually affects the brain. What is too early? The weight of evidence, no surprise, it agrees right with the Spirit of Prophecy, is that an academic setting before the age of 8 or 10 is actually damaging to the developing mind. Let's analyze this. First of all, let's look at brain development. Now, this is a huge topic. I have some books on neuroscience on my shelf that, they're this fat and they're only covering one tiny aspect of neuroscience. So I don't even begin to say that we're going to look at this in a comprehensive format, but I hope to make this as simple as possible. What is this? Anyone know? A neuron. Okay, this is a brain cell. This is what your brain uses for all of its functions, including listening to me right now, if you are. And you were born with about 100 billion of these neurons, but you don't have that many now. And that's because the brain goes through several processes of development. One of them is that it actually gets rid of unneeded neurons, and then it begins to undergo a process called myelination. Myelination, if we see here we go, is myelin is an electrically insulating compound that coats the axon of the neuron, and it speeds the information transfer, kind of like electrical insulation on a wire. So when a neuron is unmyelinated, it's kind of futile to try to use because the information just doesn't travel across that neuron fast enough. As the neuron myelinates, it now is usable and functional. So when we talk about the brain or even the baby and the child developing, we use that term a lot, right? They're developing this skill or they're learning that skill. A lot of what we're seeing happening, or we don't see it, but a lot of what is happening is myelination of neurons. As this article points out clearly, myelination of appropriate brain regions coincides with the development of specific cognitive functions, such as reading, development of vocabulary, and proficiency in executive decision-making. So as we see a child able to do certain things, that's because their brain is myelinating, and now these neurons are usable, all right? Now, this myelination process occurs in stages and on a pretty set schedule. At birth, pretty much everything is unmyelinated, all except for the very basic brain functions. But then there's a process and a schedule that the brain goes through in the development and the myelination process. I don't want to study all of this, but let me mention a few important points here. From conception to 15 months, we have very basic brain development occurring. From 15 months into 4.5 years, we have that limbic system and the relationship areas of the brain developing. And I want to pause and mention here, this is why it is so important that the little ones are with their mom and dad, but especially mom, in the first 4 years of their life, because the limbic system has a lot to do with emotional security and development. And then those relationship skills, it's centered in the first few years of life. So they need to be spending a lot of time with mom. Then around 4.5 to 7 years, we have what's called the Gestalt areas. It's often referred to as the right hemisphere, although it's not purely anatomically just the right hemisphere, but it's the Gestalt functioning of the brain is myelinated during this period of time. Boys do have a slower growth period in these stages than girls. Now, I did not say boys were slow, but they do develop differently. And that's an important function, or that's an important point to recognize. And I find it very fascinating that we are told up until the age of 8 or 10 in the Spirit of Prophecy. And from my research, that's actually a gender difference. It's around 8 in girls and around 10 in boys that we find the brain is ready for these things. There's about a 2-year lag. And I don't even like calling it a lag or slowness. It's just different. God just designed it to be different. And we actually know that the right hemisphere is very influential in spiritual strength. What is God's purpose for the boys? To grow up to be spiritual leaders in their homes, right? So it's no accident that there needs to be a little more time in developing those parts of the brain. Around 7 years in girls, around 9 years in boys, we see the left hemisphere beginning to develop. And around 8 years, the frontal lobe begins. And that frontal lobe continues into the 30s, quite some period of time. And I just want to focus on those 3 areas, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and frontal lobe. Let's look at the functions of some of these. The left hemisphere, very important for things like detail, parts and processes of language, linear patterns, logic, critical thinking, numbers, reasoning skills. Whereas the right hemisphere deals with a lot of things like images, rhythm, emotion, intuition, imagination, creativity, feeling, faith, belief, and large motor control. You can see sort of a different category of functioning in both of those, comparing those sides of the brain. Now, if you were to say which hemisphere would be necessary for academic learning, which one would you say? The left, definitely. The detail, the language, the numbers, logic, critical thinking, all those things, very necessary for academic learning. And it's not to say you're not going to use the right, but you need the left. The left is very essential. Now, the primary motor cortex is within the frontal lobe, and that helps with the fine motor development, which is very important for handwriting. Inner speech is very important for internalizing concepts as you're reading, as well as fine motor eye teaming and foveal focus, which is, again, important for reading. So, go back to our schedule here. The 3 areas highlighted in the yellow. We saw that the right hemisphere was developing from around 4.5 into 7 years, or maybe around 9 years in boys. And then around that time, as the right hemisphere is finishing up, we see the left hemisphere's major surge in development. But what's a typical school starting age? 5, 6, right? And we saw even kindergarten was focused academically. So what happens if we're trying to push the academics when the area of the brain that is responsible for academic processing hasn't even really developed yet? We're going to have a problem, right? Now, I do want to clarify before I explain what happens. I just want to clarify that some people, as they've listened to me present these things, they get the idea that it's just the left hemisphere kind of sits there idle for a while the right hemisphere develops and then they switch. And no, we're not talking purely anatomically here. We're talking more of the functions of the brain. And that's why science typically refers to this as the Gestalt and the logic areas of the brain. It is primarily centered in the right and left hemisphere, but it's not strictly that. What would be most accurate to say is just simply that the areas of the brain responsible for many types of academic learning, are not developed until around 8 years of age, especially in girls, and around 10 in boys. So the question would be, can we accelerate learning? Can we speed this process up? Okay, children's brains aren't ready until, 7, 8, 9 years of age, 10 years of age, especially in boys. But school wants to start earlier than that. Can we just speed this up somehow? Unfortunately, we cause a lot of problems when we try to do that. Alan Wolf, who's a pediatrician, put it pretty well when he said it's a myth that we can accelerate a child's developmental milestones. Children are kind of pre-programmed to reach those points. And basically, this is a secular scientist saying, no, actually, God made them to develop a certain way, and you can't go asking the brain to do something that it is not ready for when God made it that way. Now, to understand exactly what happens, I want to talk about the principle of plasticity. The brain is very moldable and shapeable and plastic, especially during early childhood. And God designed it so that they would adapt and compensate to their environment. And that's great. But we can actually trigger, or that actually can cause a problem. If we imagine a little child in class, or not even in class, but we're just asking him to do something in the books that the brain is not ready for. He's being asked to do something that the brain isn't ready for. And so the brain, because of its plasticity and because of its desire to compensate, it will actually look around, sort of, if we could put it simply. It's going to look around for an area that has developed. We're asking it to do something for which the correct region hasn't developed. It's going to look around and find somewhere that has developed, which at the young age is going to be a sort of a lower or a basic thinking center, not the higher thinking center that is needed for the academic learning. And so as it looks around and it starts routing the thinking, because the correct region hasn't developed yet, it's routing the thinking through the incorrect region of the brain. And it creates a disorganization of the brain. And then later on, when the brain has more fully developed, and we ask the child to learn or to continue learning in these particular subjects, it's already created a bad habit, if you will, through the wrong area of the brain. And we've created a disorganized learning pattern in the brain. And actually, if I can just put it simply here, if a task is asked to the brain for which the corresponding region is not matured, it will form neural routes through lower, more developed sections, resulting in almost permanent organizational damage. So trying to force a child to learn a concept for which they are not ready can actually do damage to the unmyelinated brain. And what we tend to create, well, okay, I'll get to that in a moment. Let me mention here, this is Dr. Jane Healy, a world-renowned educational psychologist. In her book, Endangered Minds, wrote, basically she just summarizes here everything that we've just looked at. Before brain regions are myelinated, they do not operate efficiently. For this reason, trying to make children or force them to master academic skills for which they do not have the requisite maturations may result in mixed-up patterns of learning. If the right or the correct brain system isn't yet available or working smoothly, forcing may create a functional organization in which less adaptive, lower systems are trained to do the work. Notice she calls it functional organization. Yes, the child can do these things and learn some of these subjects, but it's going to limit the brain. And a good example of this, let's use math, for example. A lot of times we teach math in a very repetitive way, especially on paper. There's lots of exercises to do, right? And we tend to think that it's just the repetition that's going to teach math. When in reality, math is a very logical and conceptual subject. If you understand the principle of addition and what it really means, you don't need to do 100,000 exercises to get the hang of it. But amen, right? But what we do is, as we start too early and we're trying to teach the children to do these things, the brain isn't ready, and so it's using the lower thinking centers, and because it's a lower thinking center, it's not going to grasp it conceptually, and we have to repeat it over and over and over and over and over, and we tend to think that's just the way it has to be done. But I'm sure all of you can relate to, give me the problem on paper, give me the formula to calculate, I can do that, but don't give me a word problem, right? Children hate the word problems because they have to think, they have to understand the concept. But if we wait and we learn math through everyday practical life, and we wait till the brain is ready for it, where the higher thinking centers are ready, then you ask them a question or give them a word problem, they're like, they think about it a little, oh yeah, you'd have to do this, and it makes perfect sense. But we can forever teach them to hate practical word problems, or I should say to not really understand math conceptually if we start it too early. As Dr. Healy continues, trying to drill higher level learning into immature brains may force them to perform. They're doing the exercises, they're getting through school, maybe even get good grades, but they're performing at lower level systems and thus impair the skill in question. And what we can tend to create is something known as learned helplessness. Learned helplessness means that no, they're not helpless at learning, but they have learned and they now believe that they're helpless at learning. So many times as I've worked with children, I think of one example, and this is one that would be familiar to any teacher. I was helping a student with something, and she came across a problem that she didn't understand. And I said, well, what don't you understand? Well, I don't know. But okay, the problem is asking you to do this. How do you think you can solve this? Well, I don't know. Okay, and you're like at a loss for words, right? How do I get across here? And we just went through several questions, and the answer was always, well, I don't know. There was just no conceptual understanding of what she was even supposed to be doing. And a lot of that is traceable back to just pushing it too early. We're using the lower thinking centers of the brain. A child who is required to learn things before he is ready may quickly tire of them, or he may become anxiety-ridden and so frustrated he will not try at all. I love how Dr. Healy says it here. I often wonder how many children decide they are dumb. They're not dumb, but they decide they are. I'm just bad at math. I'm just bad at reading. I'm just bad at English, whatever it is. We just decide they are dumb about certain subjects, when the truth is that someone simply laid on the learning too soon and in a form other than the one they needed to receive it in at the time. Many children acquire learned helplessness at school when they are confronted with learning tasks that are too difficult for their level of ability. I would contend that much of today's school failure results from academic expectations for which students' brains were not prepared, but were bulldozed into them anyway. Any learning that has to be pushed into a child may end up doing more harm than good. Plunged daily into the fire of inappropriate expectation, children's early promise shrivels, and non-learning becomes a habit. They may be labeled, treated, exhorted, and eventually tutored, but the basic issue remains unchanged. The school and the child are on different schedules. And that's really the core of it, right? We're not following that schedule that God designed. So, just to make this a little bit more practical, just some tips for the parents to think about here. First of all, be patient. Don't succumb to the pressure of the world who say, oh, are they reading yet? What grade are they in? Look, you're following God's schedule, not the world's schedule. Just be patient. But don't just be idle the whole time. Remember, the counsel was about what you should be doing, not what you shouldn't be doing. We're kind of focusing on what you shouldn't be doing, but the counsel was pretty strong about what you should be doing. So make sure you're learning in practical, hands-on ways rather than in books, and that includes a lot of time out in nature, and focus on character. It's not only the brain that is affected, though. I want to talk for a few minutes about the development of the eyes. Eye teaming refers to the ability to use both eyes to focus on a subject. This is essential for reading. And then foveal focus is two-dimensional focus. When you're looking at this is three-dimensional. But when you start reading, you switch to two-dimensional vision because you're reading text on a page. These functions don't fully develop until approximately age 7 to 9. So what's going to happen if we're trying to ask a child to do reading before the eye has fully developed? Less than 5% of our vision actually occurs in our eyes. In other words, the brain does most of the processing of our vision. And for full vision to occur, information from all cerebral lobes must be accessed. But what's the problem if the whole brain hasn't developed yet? Full vision is not going to be occurring. Dr. Moore explains this very well as he says that even though a single clear visual image may be received by the eye, in other words, he's just saying, it's not like they're blind or something, but a child may still not be able to decode printed material because of deficiencies in organization and interpretation in the central nervous system due to lack of maturation. So that's from kind of an eye-brain connection standpoint. But we also know from research that this negatively affects the eye itself. The eyeball is not completely shaped with collagen fibers until approximately age 9. Long periods of reading without relaxing the focus into the distance could possibly cause inflammation and the elongation of the eyeball, leading to myopia. Now let me talk about myopia a little bit here. When we look into the distance, our eyes are at rest. Everybody look out the window. That's restful to your eyes. But now, as you bring your vision into this room and you bring something up close to your eyes and you start reading, those muscles, in fact, I think I have a diagram here. There we go. So we see the normal eye on the left-hand side of our screen. Do you see at the top of this image, which is the front of the eyeball, we have the lens. And then on the sides of the lens, which are not pointed out in this diagram, but on the sides of the lens are what's called the ciliary bodies, which are muscles that contract and relax to control the shape of the lens and bring the vision, the focus of the vision from either the distance to up close. So as you look into the distance, your eyes are relaxed. But as you look up close, those muscles on the sides of the lens have to contract, and they bring your focus up close, and nothing wrong with that. God made it to do that way. That's called an acute spasm of the ciliary muscles. But as you keep focusing on something for a long period of time, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, you're doing long periods of reading, those muscles are constantly uptight. And of course, we could apply the same things to screens, right? Watching television on the iPad, on the device or whatever, same thing. Looking at something up close. Those muscles are tight, 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 tight. They reach a point called chronic spasm. Now they begin pulling on their attachment points around the outside layers of the eyeball, which you saw is soft during childhood, and they begin stretching the eyeball. And so now we get to our diagram on the right-hand side of the screen. That's myopia. The eyeball becomes stretched out from focusing on something up close for a long period of time. And myopia is not a too familiar term here in the US, but this is nearsightedness. It's the most common eye problem in the world. What's fascinating is to look at the rates of myopia around the world. The US is about 50% myopic, and that's pretty bad. Whereas East Asia, 90% myopic. Seoul, Korea, 96% myopic, almost the entire population. And scientists have for a long time said that myopia was purely genetic. There's nothing you could do about it. If your parents had myopia, you were probably going to get it too. Well, then they did a study in Alaska among the Inuit or the Eskimo populations. And there was an interesting situation in Alaska. As you know, Alaska became a state fairly late. I think it was the last one, wasn't it? It was Alaska or Hawaii. I don't remember which one.
Alaska 49, Hawaii 50, 1959.
Okay, we have the history buff here. So Alaska was a little before Hawaii. But it was fairly late. And so it was an interesting situation because we had a lot of indigenous peoples, the Inuit, living in Alaska, who didn't really have a lot of formal schooling. But then Alaska became a state and started requiring schooling at a fairly early age, 5, 6 years old, something like that. So we had an entire generation of children and young people who had gone to school, but the parents and grandparents had not. And they did a study on myopia. They found that the children were 60% myopic. Now, if myopia is genetic, what percentage would we expect to find in the parents and grandparents? The same, right? Probably worse because, it's going to be exacerbated by age. Here's what they found. Can you see it there on the slide? Less than 1% among the parents and grandparents. And they said, it's not purely genetic. There must be other factors involved. So they began to do studies around the world, and they found something very, very clear. The more time a people group spent indoors and the earlier they went to school, the higher the rates of myopia. Again, comparing the areas we've already looked at, the US, 50%, East Asia, 90%. Which part of the world, which people group spends more time pressuring on academics than spending indoors? Obviously, East Asia. They have twice the amount of homework on average that a US child has. Africa, though, a continent that's still predominantly indigenous, or at least large populations of people there living in rural areas. Often the children, even if they are going to school, are having to walk to school, spending a lot more time outdoors. The average around the continent of Africa is around 10 to 20% myopic. So again, clear parallels and connections between the amount of time a group of people, or a nation even, is spending indoors and studying and the rate of myopia. Interesting study in Natal, Brazil. Within the city, they found the rate of myopia was 13%, which is pretty low. But then they found that tribes living around to the northwest, they were 2.7% myopic. So even within this generally the same genetic groups, then those in the city had higher rates of myopia. This study was specifically about myopia in Brazil. They found that the indigenous people of the upper Rio Negro region of the Amazon rainforest in northwestern Brazil, and they found that myopia was rare among the indigenous population. And they also found, this was fascinating to me, because everyone just says, I mean, you go to your eye doctor today, why do I have myopia? It's either going to be a genetics or age. And they found age was not associated with the refractive errors of the indigenous people. It was not connected to age. Brazilians from the small city in which the study was performed had higher rates of myopia. Sounds like God had a reason for country living, right? Older pre-education adults also had a very low prevalence of myopia, 2%, whereas the younger, slightly educated Brazilians had a higher prevalence of myopia. And they found that the low prevalence of myopia in the illiterate indigenous people is consistent with other studies and suggests that myopia is related to literacy. Pretty interesting, right? And it's also interesting when you study and you find that there is no part of the brain that is dedicated to reading, because God never designed for us to even need to read. He wanted us to commune with Him face to face, and our minds to be so strong we would retain everything He told us. But as a result of sin, we have to have books, and praise the Lord for books. I'm very thankful for books. I'm glad we have the Word of God to study in its written form, but that wasn't even God's ideal. That's a plan B. And it is linked to higher rates of myopia and nearsightedness. How can we avoid that? The best way is to wait for the reading. It is absolutely clear from the research, the earlier a child learns to read, and it's not only reading, but it's doing up-close work, crafts even, stuff at the table all the time versus being outdoors, you will have higher rates of myopia. If you wait until the eye has more fully firmed up with those collagen fibers, 8, 9, 10 years of age before you allow them to do much reading, then you significantly lower the risk of myopia. And if a child does learn to read at an early age, the research shows that we should limit it to no more than about 15 or 20 minutes at a time, and at most twice a day, just to limit and to protect the eyes. So the lifestyle factors in the development of myopia are definitely close-up work is a major one. There is one other aspect, and that is the lack of time outdoors. They find that children who spend less time outside are at a greater risk of developing myopia. And part of the reason for this, I want to refer back to our diagram here. Remember that a myopic eye is elongated in shape. A study found light stimulates the release of dopamine in the retina, and this neurotransmitter, in turn, blocks the elongation of the eye during development. Wait, elongation of the eye, isn't that myopia? Yeah, so light was stimulating the release of a neurotransmitter that blocked that elongation of the eyeball. And you say, okay, light, what do you mean light? Am I supposed to, stare into a flashlight for some time every day? No. Ian Morgan, who's a myopia researcher at Australian National University, he found that children need to spend around 3 hours a day under light levels of at least 10,000 lux to be protected against myopia. All right, first of all, how many hours a day? 3. 3 hours a day. But recent research has indicated children are spending, I think it is 90, if I remember the statistic right, 94% of their time is spent indoors. So they're definitely not getting 3 hours outside every day. That's a lot of time. But then 10,000 lux, how much is 10,000 lux? Well, if you go outside on a sunny day and you stand in the shade, you're getting about 10,000 lux. Full sunlight is more than 10,000, but in the shade on a sunny day, you'd be getting about 10,000 lux. Lux is a measurement of the volume, the total volume of light. So if you imagine, take one of these windows here and go outside that window, you'd be getting about 10,000 lux. But as you come into this room, that volume of light that's coming through that window now is dissipated into the volume of this room. In other words, it's not the intensity of a single source of light, it's the total volume of light. And so the lux measurement inside a room drastically drops, even if you have good indoor lighting, as we have here. So the average, anyone want to take a guess what the average well-lit classroom or office is in a lux measurement? 3,000? Good guess. That's pretty pessimistic, isn't it? 500. I was shocked. 500 lux is the average. Of course, I was doing a seminar in New Zealand a while ago, and somebody raised their hand and said, well, actually here in New Zealand, we require at least 700 lux. And I said, great, but I mean, that's not 10,000, right? I mean, yeah, right, not even 10%. So, the only way to do that is to go outside and get some physical activity. I think of a friend of mine who had severe myopia, and she was told as she was going for her yearly checkups to the eye doctor. She was, I think, 12 at the time, 12 or 13. And she went to the eye doctor and he said, "I'm really sorry. At the rate your myopia is progressing, you'll probably be legally blind within about 1 year." Can you imagine hearing that as a 12 or 13-year-old? And so the mother asked the eye doctor, said, "Well, what's causing it? Is there anything we can do about it?" What do you think the eye doctor said? "It's genetic. Nothing you can do. You've got bad vision. Your husband has bad vision. She's going to have bad vision too." So they were driving home, and the mother was thinking about that and said, "That doesn't make any sense. The Bible says the curse causeless will not come. There's a reason, right?" And she says also, "My son has perfect vision. So why does my son have perfect vision and my daughter is about to go legally blind if this is purely a genetic factor?" So she started doing some research, and she found this research about spending the time outside. She said, "Oh, that's interesting, because my son practically lives outside. I can't get him inside. Whereas my daughter hates going outside." She said, "I wonder if there's a connection." She talked to her daughter, and she said, "All right, we're going to make a change to the family schedule. We're going to do a little experiment. You are now required to be outside for at least 2 hours every day." Oh, that was a battle. She would go outside. She'd do her homework outside. She'd practice her violin outside. She didn't really get the whole idea of, like physical activity, spending time in nature, and that whole thing. But at least she was outside getting that 10,000 lux. 6 months later, she was back to the eye doctor. He checked her eyes out, and he said, "I don't quite understand this. Your eyes are the same as they were 6 months ago. No progression in your myopia." They said, "Thank you very much." Didn't tell the doctor what they were doing. They wanted an unbiased opinion. They went back home, continued for another 6 months. Back to the eye doctor. She should be almost legally blind by now. It's been a year. He said, "I don't understand this. Your eyes are the same as they were 6 months or a year ago." He said, "This just doesn't happen. Myopia is supposed to progress, especially as fast as it was progressing earlier." And so they explained to the doctor what they were doing, how they found this research. They were spending the time outside. And they said, "Do you think, maybe that has something to do with it?" And the doctor's like, "No, it's just coincidence." Of course it wasn't coincidence though, right? This was God's plan, God's method, and God's methods always work. So much more we could look at here, but I want to talk a little bit about physical development. We've talked about the importance of physical activity already. But this is vital, and this is another reason why children shouldn't be sitting there with the textbooks at too early of an age. Who knows, what are the two most common commands given to children in the classroom? Anyone know? What was that? Be quiet and sit still, right? Sit still and be quiet. Is there a problem with that? Well, we talked about the benefits of physical activity. We saw the cerebellum and the importance of the cerebellum and how physical activity aids the development of the cerebellum. We also know that physical activity enhances the growth and greater connections between the neurons. We know that in order for a child to be able to sit still, pay attention, and visually remember the shapes of letters and numbers, that's school, right? That's learning academics. In order for that to happen, the child first needs to have developed his or her proprioceptive system, which is a sense of the body in space. And research has found the only way they're going to develop that proprioceptive system is whole body activity. Running, jumping, climbing, all those things they like to do outside. There's also something known as the brain-derived neurotropic factor, shortened mercifully to BDNF. And this chemical is released into our bloodstream whenever we move. Anytime we're moving our muscles, it causes the release of a chain of proteins that releases BDNF. BDNF is very important for our brains even as adults, but it is vital for children because it has been found to be required for myelination to proceed. So that principle of brain development that we saw earlier, the myelination of the brain, the development of the brain, BDNF is a chemical that is necessary for that to proceed. And physical activity causes the release of BDNF. So in other words, physical activity is needed, absolutely necessary for the child's brain to develop. As we tell them to sit still and do the academics and study their books, we're actually preventing their brain from developing. And we tend to think, more pressure in the academics, we'll give them a head start, and we're going to, help them be ready for, the spiel. But it's actually backwards. Physical activity will help them be more ready. Catherine Davies, professor of pediatrics, says, I think that parents need to go to the educators and say, why is my child sitting down for 6 hours a day when he's a 7-year-old boy and needs to move? That would be a valuable question, right? If every parent asked that question, things would change. But the Spirit of Prophecy told us this long before, when it said small children should be left free as lambs to run out of doors, to be free and happy, and should be allowed the most favorable opportunities to lay the foundation for sound constitutions. God knew what he was talking about. Free as lambs. And I find this interesting because this statement has also been misunderstood at times, and we've understood free as lambs to mean wake up the children in the morning, feed them something, open the door, send them out, and say, come back at supper time. Total absence of direction and guidance, and they just raise themselves for the first 8 or 10 years, and then we buckle down for the academics. No, friends, that's not what God is talking about here. Have you ever seen any lambs? Have we seen lambs? I know they're not too common. Wendell had some sheep, right? When you see some lambs playing, is there anyone else nearby? Yeah, who? Mom. Mom's watching. The mother sheep are keeping an eye on their lambs. So when God says the children should be free as lambs, he doesn't mean absence of the mother. He's talking about the activity, being outdoors, in nature, being active. But mom is right there to guide and direct. So as much of the day as possible should be active. Playing together also is great for children. We're told, Spirit of Prophecy says that parents should play with their children. And just for humor's sake, I found a study recently. I thought it was pretty funny. It said, children should learn mainly through play until age of 8, says Lego. Well, yeah, they probably would say that, wouldn't they? But as I looked at the research, they had it absolutely correct. They had some very valid research. Children definitely should learn through play. I would disagree, though, where it says mainly through play. The Spirit of Prophecy places a large emphasis on children learning practical work throughout the everyday duties of the home also, and that is a benefit too. So, as I've added here, work together. Now, we said children are told to sit still, but also be quiet. Is there a problem with that? Have you ever noticed little children playing together, a group of children? Are they perfectly quiet? No, definitely not, right? Chattering and talking constantly, lots of noise. What about a little child by himself? Little 2, 3, 4-year-old. Is he perfectly quiet? Not always. Not usually, actually. He's often talking to himself, isn't he? And you're like, what's he talking about in there? And you listen a little, and he's just chattering to himself. That's because children don't have something known as inner speech developed. Inner speech is the ability that we have as adults to think about something without having to say it out loud. Although we all catch ourselves thinking out loud at times, I'm sure, right? But we have the ability. We can read silently and internalize those thoughts. We can think about something without having to say it out loud. Children don't have that ability. Until around the age of 8, children have to actually verbalize what they're thinking about. In fact, they say that if we're trying to have a child read to themselves silently, it does them very little good. Very little of what they are reading to themselves actually ends up in their mind. They have to say it out loud. They have to think out loud. So as we're making a child sit there hour after hour in the classroom and telling them to be quiet, what are we telling them to do? Stop thinking. We're preventing their brain from developing. And Dr. Healy explains here, good language, like the synapses that make it possible, is gained only from interactive engagement. Children need to talk as well as to hear. And we also know that a good experience in talking and expressing themselves early in childhood will help them learn better in the academics later on. Oh, this is actually one of the bits of research I was thinking of. So insistent is the need for outer speech to hear one's own voice and thoughts that silent reading is ineffective before the age of 7. So we're telling our child to, sit there and read. It's not going to do them a whole lot of good. Not much is going to sink into their mind. And of course, real life conversation is much better than digital communication. It's really interesting, actually. They're doing studies on how listening to audio affects the brain of a young child versus listening to their parent read. Because it's a big thing now where we have our children do audio devotions. They're listening to something. And I'm not saying that's bad for them to listen to those things. Of course, that's good. But the research is becoming quite clear that the parent's own voice heard in live format. They've even done studies where they record the parent's voice, and it doesn't affect the child in the same way as them actually being there listening to their parent's voice. So it's far better, it's going to stick in the mind better if the child is sitting there on the lap of the parent while they read them the Bible story versus listening to something. And a little bit more research from Dr. Joe Frost. The number of words an infant hears each day is the single most important predictor of later intelligence, school success, and social competence. However, recent brain research supports earlier studies concluding that there can be too much stimulation and too little stimulation. Merely filling the child with information or scheduling too many activities may lead to overstimulation. So what do they need? Live language in a warm emotional context with a caring adult, not endless, mindless television or video games, boost language development. Information received in an emotional context is more powerful in stimulating neural development than information alone. Even the tone of voice makes a difference. Friends, if God's method were for a child just to listen to the reading of the Bible, he would have said in Deuteronomy, make sure you send your children to church every week. That's not what he said, though, did he? He says, parents, put these words in your heart and teach them to your children through that emotional connection and the relationship. Now, I think I've been telling you to sit still and be quiet for a little too long. Why don't we stand up for a moment, take a deep breath, get a little stretch, get a little oxygen into our brains. You can stay standing as long as you like, but I'll continue. Emotional development. We used to kind of believe that we had the emotional development of the brain and we had the cognition area of the brain. We that is absolutely not the truth. The emotion and cognition areas of the brain are very intertwined. They are connected together. In fact, research is now explaining to us quite clearly that emotional development lays the foundation for cognitive development. This is why often when we have a child with a learning disability of some kind, a good researcher will look at the home environment first. And more often than not, we will find some kind of disturbance, emotional neglect, perhaps a divorce, separation, could just be actual neglect on the part of the parent, but there's some emotional disturbance there that often triggers a cognitive problem of some kind or a learning disability. And emotional security is seen by the developing brain as a fundamental need of survival. So, think about what are the needs of survival, right? We have food, water, shelter, warmth, things like that. For a young brain, emotional security is considered as important as food. So how do we develop emotional security? Simple as relationship. A quality relationship will help develop emotional security. That time with mother and child is absolutely vital. Emotional well-being and social competence provide a strong foundation for emerging cognitive abilities, and together they are the bricks and mortar that comprise the foundation of human development. The emotional and physical health, social skills, and cognitive linguistic capacities that emerge in the early years are all important prerequisites for success in school and later in the workplace and in community. God knew this, as he told us in the spirit of prophecy, of how the early education of a child needed to be centered in the family. As I mentioned earlier, though, the problem is not only with sending them off to school. It's about what we're doing in the home. And the research is finding that as we're asking them to do tasks for which the brain is not ready, we already saw that, it can actually cause them to feel inadequate and insecure, even if it's happening within the home. When children have educational experiences that are not geared to their developmental level or in tune with their learning needs and cultures, it can cause them great harm, including feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, and confusion. And so we need to be careful about what we're asking the child to do, aside from just sending them off to school, but even within the home. Time together, very important for emotional development. Time spent cuddling, gazing, and playing establishes a bond of security, trust, and respect on which the entire child development pyramid is based. Dr. Raymond Moore put it the best as he said, "A child relates to people and to the world primarily through interaction with parents or parent surrogates. Even the best daycare cannot completely neutralize the negative social, emotional, and cognitive effects of mother-child discontinuity. When the child is allowed to develop a strong bond with an adult, especially a parent, a much more emotionally stable and socially competent child will be the result." But now, what about the question of socialization? Here we are talking about how we shouldn't send the child to school too early, but how will they get socialized? We kind of addressed that this morning already in how we talked about true socialization is going to happen within the home. The best socialization is a mixture of ages, not just peer-to-peer. And the research is very clear on that we often create negative socialization as a result of pushing children off into an environment with only their peers at an early age. I think of a little boy that I worked with. He was about 5 years old, I think, and he had some pretty serious emotional issues, a lot of anger problems. He didn't want to be touched very much, didn't like hugs. He was always picking fights with his siblings. He had major behavioral problems. And as part of one of the projects that I was doing for research in my classes, I decided to investigate this little boy. I was in a position to kind of observe without it being too official that I was investigating his situation. And I found that he had plenty of access to peers. Other kids the same age, no problem there. He had access to that. He wasn't always the best friend. It kind of caused a lot of problems, but he had access to kids his same age. But if you looked at his home life, his mom spent most of her time on Facebook, and his father was either working or in school and not there giving him very much attention. And so he was pretty much raising himself at 5 years of age. And I said, I wonder what a little bit of adult contact in a loving relationship manner would do. What kind of effect would I see? And so I fit it into my schedule to spend maybe half an hour every week with him. Maybe I get an hour in, or half hour twice a week, something like that. And I was documenting the changes in him, or if I would see any changes. And so we would just do fun stuff together. We'd go for a hike together, we'd carry firewood in, go weed the garden, just do some fun things. And I just was always there to talk to him, see what he was interested in, express an interest in him. At the end of a couple of months, research period, this little boy had completely changed. His anger problems were almost gone. His behavioral issues were gone, at least when I was there. So much so that his parents, which didn't notice very much, actually noticed the improvement. He just turned around completely. I could come in the door and he'd run up to me and give me a big hug. He would have never done that before. Complete transformation with just a half of an hour twice a week of focused adult attention in his life. Imagine what it would have been with a parent doing that, right? All day, every day. What a transformation. So even though he had, quote, socialization, it wasn't good socialization, and it wasn't God's plan of socialization within the family. It wasn't what he needed for proper emotional development. Now, another question that sometimes gets asked is, what about memory? School teaches you how to memorize things, supposedly. We can talk about that a little bit, but suppose it does. And don't children need to go to school early to learn how to memorize things? Well, as the research finds, it's actually the opposite. Just as we saw, the more time a child spends in school, the worse the eyesight tends to be. The more time we spend in school, typically the worse our memories are. Here's an example. If we look at indigenous peoples around the world, they actually have some of the best memories on the planet. The North Queensland Aborigines, for example, recite a song by memory that takes 5 nights to complete. I can't even remember all the words to a hymn out of the hymnal, right? Primitive peoples can observe a herd of several hundred animals and detect the absence of a single animal and know which one it is without counting. Many of their vocabularies are full of names for very detailed aspects of the world around them. This idea of looking at the herd of several hundred animals and knowing which one is missing. Wendell, you've got some cows. Can you take a glance out the window and say, oh, I'm missing such and such a cow? You just know which one it is. Right? This is not something that we really relate to. And I kind of struggled to believe it. Well, then I was in Tanzania, Africa. And part of the mission that I was working at there, I was working with a school there, but the mission there had livestock. They had some cows. I think they had about 70 cows. And they would hire Maasai. You guys know about the Maasai. These are famous in Africa for herding cows. They're very skilled with livestock, especially cattle. So the mission would actually hire Maasai to take care of their cattle. And after I shared some of this at the school, the livestock director, who was a volunteer from the U.S., but just kind of overseeing the program there, she came and talked to me afterwards. She goes, you know what you said there is absolutely true. I said, really? Tell me about it. She said, yeah, our native Maasai, we can bring the herd of cows to the watering hole in the evening, and they'll just look it over, and they'll mention to their buddy, hey, we're missing such and such a cow. And they name the cow they're missing. And she said, one day I just asked him, I said, I'm the livestock director here. Can you teach me how to know when I'm missing a cow? And they looked at her with shock on their face. They're like, how do you not know you're missing a cow? It's just obvious information to them. So how is this possible? Dr. Desarle explains further here. She says, while the school person depends heavily on external signs, such as the written word, can we add Google to that also? To hold knowledge for him, the primitive native depends on memory. Every detail of a landscape is remembered with what seems to be a photographic memory, even the first time passing through. Though most children have an eidetic memory, it is rare among schooled adults, but not among primitive non-schooled adults. So we actually are born with an incredible memory. God designed us that way, but we school it out of ourselves. As we learn that something else always holds the information, we give it to children year after year. Here's the textbook, just remember this for the test, and then you can move on. When the studies show that spending time in nature, just as God said it should be, will actually give us better memories. Another story I was just thinking of, also from Africa. A friend of mine, his father-in-law was a missionary in Africa, and he told this story. I don't remember whether it was he or a friend of his who was a speaker, was in a village one time in rural Africa and preached the sermon on Sabbath morning or Sunday, whatever it was. And 2 years later, he went back to that village and visited them. And he was invited to speak. And so he got up to do the sermon, and he said, just curious, how many remember when I was here 2 years ago? Everybody raised their hands. Yeah, of course, we remember 2 years ago when you were here. He said, oh, and he's kind of joking, and he says, well, how many remember what I preached about 2 years ago? And they all said, yeah, absolutely, we remember. And he said, really? You actually remember what I preached about? They said, oh, yes, of course. He said, okay, prove it to me. And they said, were you just wanting the topic, or did you want us to recite the sermon back to you? They remembered that sermon, heard it once, 2 years before, remembered it verbatim, word for word. So no, going to school is not necessary for a good memory. In fact, we might have a better one if we stay out for the early years. Now, let's talk about one that a lot of parents get some concern about, understandably, and that is the question of reading. It is a myth. Just state it right off the bat here. It is a myth that we need to teach reading early or children won't learn it. You know, as is brought out by some research, right here. In many schools, children are identified as behind with reading before they would have even started school in many other countries. So we have this arbitrary age where, if they're not reading by such and such an age, something must be wrong with them, when in other countries they haven't even gone to school yet. Who determines what the correct age is to learn how to read? To understand this well, we really need to understand what lays a foundation for good reading skills. I want to read something here from the Early Childhood Research Quarterly. This is a very respected journal in early childhood research. And it found that in the foundation for later reading, and in particular reading comprehension, is language. Not flashcards, not word lists, not vocabulary, language. So how do we develop good language skills? That should be our question. If this lays a foundation for good reading skills, how do we develop good language skills? Talk to each other. It's really that simple. Simply have conversation. So in learning to read, the first step we can take to teach our children to learn how to read is actually just to talk together. We lay a foundation in the brain with good vocabulary and good sentence structure and good grammar and all these things. They can learn them just in everyday conversation. Another thing you can do as they grow is answer the questions and engage in incidental learning. Children are great about asking questions, aren't they? So as they ask the question, Mom, can you read me this story? Or, Mom, what's that sign say? Or, what's the name of this book? Or, can you tell me how to write my name? The things that come up, right? Take a minute and just teach them that. And then move on. You're not sitting down drilling them and teaching them how to read. You're just taking advantage of the questions that come up in everyday life. And as you do that, they're putting together the building blocks in their brain. You can also use books and reading as a source of gaining needed information about something, rather than what I'm saying there is as in contrast to this is something you have to read, get through these number of pages, and you've done your reading assignment. Rather, it should be, okay, we're going to read an interesting story, or we have a question about something and we look it up and we find the answer, that kind of thing. And if we follow these sort of steps, learning to read can really be quite easy. The research indicates that it only takes about 30 hours of contact with a little bit of reading instruction to become college proficient at reading if the brain is ready. But if we're not ready, we try to push it ahead of time, it just becomes what we're all familiar with, where you have to drill it and you drill it and drill it, and many children don't even learn to read very well. When the studies are very clear that those who learn to read later actually have better reading abilities, and you'll often avoid a lot of the reading problems that develop in children by starting later. I think of a mom, and I could just tell story after story like this. I've lost track of the number of mothers who have told me how their child just taught themselves how to read when they were just patient enough and engaged in the everyday teaching here and there. They exposed them to books. It wasn't that they put the books in a locker and kept them there until they were 8 or 10. No, they exposed them to it in everyday life, but it wasn't their focus. They weren't trying to teach it. And one day the child just taught themselves how to read. In just a few weeks, they can be completely proficient. I remember one mom who said her boy came up to her one day. He had a book, and he said, "Mom, I'm going to read you a story." And she said, "Okay, that's very nice. Go ahead, read me the story." And she's expecting the book is upside down, and he just makes up a story. But he actually opened the book correctly and read her what was on the page. And it just surprised her completely. She said, "What just happened?" And she said, "Oh, you know what? He knows that story pretty well. He probably just memorized it." So she turned to another part of the book that she knew he wasn't very familiar with and said, "Read this to me." And he read it to her. And she said, in her words, she goes, "I was a little upset because I was homeschooling and it was my job to teach him how to read and he just beat me to it." But she thought about it and she said, "Well, actually, I did teach him how to read. I just never was that intentional about making it a scheduled part of the day. It was just stuff that would come up in everyday life, and he was putting the building blocks together in his brain, and eventually it just blossomed, and he learned how to read." And so it really can be a lot easier than we usually make it out to be. Again, the research is clear that we shouldn't be letting them read for long periods of time at an early age, even if they do teach themselves how to read. Some children will teach themselves how to read at 6 years old. If they do, just don't have long periods of reading because of the damage to the eyes. Again, wait until 8 to 10 years of age for that. And just to share one scientific article about this was some fascinating research that, again, kind of shook up the community, the scientific community on this topic. There was a study done, again, from the Early Childhood Research Quarterly, and they compared two groups of students. One was given reading instruction starting at age 5, and the other was giving reading instruction starting at age 7, and they compared these two groups. They found that the earlier reading instruction age group had initially superior letter naming, non-word, word, and passage reading. And I would say, well, of course they would, right? It's earlier, they're being taught earlier. Initially, it says they are going to be better at it. But it says this difference in reading skill disappeared by age 11, and the later reading instruction age group generally had greater reading comprehension. Now, let's see this on a chart. At age 5, okay, so just to interpret this, this is measuring average decoding and reading fluency by chronological age. The blue represents the group who began their instruction at age 5, and the orange represents the group who began their instruction at age 7. So if we notice on the chart there, age 5, that first blue on the left, we have the first group. At age 6, it's measuring their decoding and reading fluency. Evidently, there's a few of the second group that have begun to teach themselves how to read, because there's a little bit of skill there. But then age 7, we have the official starting point of that second group represented in the orange. They're now being taught how to read. Look at age 8, and let's think about that for a moment. Those who started earlier have twice the abilities of those who started later at age 8. Now let's just think about that. Think about what age we're often comparing children. Right about age 8, right? You know, they're reading yet. How are they doing? What about if we waited a year? Look at age 9. What happened to the group who started later? They caught up to the ones who started earlier. Meanwhile, the ones who started earlier, they really haven't advanced very much, have they? That's because it's routing the thinking through the lower thinking center. Then at age 10, look what happens. Those who started later are now beginning to pass up in their abilities, those who started earlier. And age 11, look at that. Those who started later are actually quite a bit more advanced than the ones who started earlier. The study found that children who started at 5 developed less positive attitudes toward reading and showed poorer text comprehension than those children who had started later. Our findings suggest that reading is not assured. That success at reading is not assured by an earlier beginning. And the research is clear. Starting later typically is a much better chance of being a good reader. But I want to share a very fascinating story that was done in a kindergarten. It was an experiment, a sort of informal experiment that was done in a kindergarten classroom. And I'll read it to you here. It is true that some children can learn to read remarkably early. Nothing, it's like, yeah, okay, they can. But the fact that they can does not necessarily mean that they should. Should is another question. One school district set up an experiment to help decide this question. Some kindergartners in the district received extensive instruction in reading. Others spent the same amount of time learning science. They melted ice. They observed thermometers in hot and cold places. They played with magnets, grew plants, learned about animal life, and so on. Books and pictures were available for these children if they wanted them, but no formal lessons in reading were held. So we have these two groups. One receives extensive instruction in reading. The other one, play with some science, do some experiments. Then they waited a bit till 3rd grade, and they tested these groups of children on not their science abilities, their reading abilities. So which group do you think would do better at reading? Well, you'd think it'd be the ones who had reading instruction, right? By 3rd grade, the science children were far ahead of the reading children in their science scores, in their reading scores. The reason? Their vocabularies and thinking skills were more advanced. They could read on more topics and understand higher level materials. The reading children, by starting earlier, used up a lot of learning time on the skills of reading, while the science children spent time learning real stuff. And when they did begin reading, they were older and knew more and learned in a fraction of the time that the others took. Lisa Nielsen put it the best, I think. She said, the reason that kids need to learn to read so early in school is because in school, kids read about doing stuff instead of doing stuff. Who can relate to that? Just get me out of this classroom, let me go do something. When kids live life outside of school, they actually get to do stuff. So it's not as important to read about it in order to learn. Very good point. So just to make that practical, Talk together with your child. Read to them. That's good, of course. It doesn't need to be your ultimate focus, but sure, it helps. And allow plenty of time for movement and activity, and utilize the questions and engage in incidental learning. A couple other points I want to touch on before we close. One of them is the effect on boys. This is a rather solemn thing to think about. We are seeing significant problems in boys today. And a lot of that has to do with that difference in brain development that we talked about earlier. Because of the approximately 2-year lag in brain development in boys compared to girls, all the effects we've just discussed will be intensified in the boys. In other words, the problems that we see as a result of pushing it too early, we're going to see even worse problems in the boys. According to one of the best-selling authors on boys' issues today, Michael Gurian, he says, boys today are not learning as well as girls. Boys receive 70% of the D's and F's given all students. Boys cause 90% of classroom discipline problems. 80% of all high school dropouts are boys. Millions of boys are on Ritalin and other mind-bending control drugs. And 3 out of 4 students labeled learning disabled are boys. Now, did God just create the boys to be a problem? No. Although I asked that question one time, and there was a brother and sister sitting on the front pew, and the sister was very quick to assure me that, yes, boys were the problem. But that's not God's purpose, right? They're more active, yes. And we tend to view that activity as a problem. But as a friend of mine, or as I heard it said, I forget who said it, but they said we're treating boys like defective girls. Treating boys like defective girls. It's like, that's absolutely right. Boys need a different learning environment. God just made them that way. There's nothing wrong with it. But we put them at the same age into the school system and ask them to learn in the same way. And we're like, they're obviously not doing as well as the girls. There must be something wrong with the boys. There's nothing wrong with them. They're just different. Just give them some more time. The early curriculum, and let's just think about this really seriously here. God's purpose for our boys is to be the spiritual leaders of their homes and their churches. Satan hates this. He does not want male leadership in our church. That's plain. I don't think I have to point out to you the issues that we're seeing in our church. It's clear. Satan does not want male leadership. And yes, he's using many methods to work against that, but this is absolutely one of them. Year after year, the little boys begin to believe that they're just inferior, I guess, to the girls. They're just dumber than the girls. Something's wrong with them. That's not the way God designed it. The early curriculum is more accelerated than ever before. Boys are expected to do too much too soon. Their brains aren't ready for it. They begin their school careers in the dumb group. They're frustrated with their lack of ability. They start disliking school, and they begin to avoid it. We're seeing that more than ever now. I found one research quite interesting, one study that was done that found boys with summer birth dates tend to be advantaged academically by postponing kindergarten entrance 1 year. Now, we've seen research how delaying it several years would be such an advantage, but they found even 1 year difference made a big difference for the boys. This is also very linked to ADHD and many attention problems, including, and not even only attention problems, a lot of learning disabilities. I've kind of alluded to that a few times as I've mentioned it kind of in passing, but let me just accentuate this point right here, that a lot of attention problems and a lot of learning disabilities that we're seeing in children, including some that are often blamed purely as a genetic factor, such as dyslexia, which definitely has genetic factors, but it is exacerbated, certainly, by the early formal academics. And many of the attention problems and the learning disorders that we see today could be avoided or at least greatly lessened by delaying the academic entrance. And definitely ADHD is one of those. One study found that delaying kindergarten for 1 year, again, this is just 1 year, imagine if we did it for a couple of years, but only 1 year, reduced inattention and hyperactivity by 73%. Do you realize what a significant amount that is in the research? Most research is like, 1 or 2% improvement. No, 73% reduction in ADHD symptoms. And it virtually eliminated the probability that an average child at that age would have an abnormal or higher than normal rating for the inattentive hyperactive behavioral measure. Many children may have a tendency toward this. Yes, it is sometimes genetic, but the research is very clear that asking them to sit still and do those books is only going to exacerbate the problem. And if we delay it, if we allow them the time for the activity, we'll often eliminate that issue. Now, I realize the question that could be asked is, okay, I mean, I'm convinced on this topic. I'm convinced on the idea that children need to be, we need to wait before doing the academic training. We need to wait, if we are sending them to school. But even in the homeschool, we should wait before pushing the books. But how will they ever catch up? If we start them at age 10, then, won't they be like graduating high school at 24 or something like that? How is that going to work? Good question. Certainly they won't be left behind, though. When children start the academics after age 8, they often end up far ahead of those who started earlier. And when children are given time for their minds to develop, they will experience much less frustration when the academics do begin, and they will learn much faster because they are ready to learn it. Let me share just a little bit of research on this. In a study of 300 individuals who started school at about age 8 or later, all quickly caught up with their classes and in most cases performed well above the class average. That's just one study out of many. There is substantial agreement among school entrance age researchers that children who enter school later are significantly higher in academic achievement than those who enter earlier. Learning problems might thus be avoided, since forcing instruction on an unready child can result in learning skills with little transfer value, where they don't get it, they don't understand it conceptually, we talked about that earlier, or in just turning off learning altogether. Most late starts, usually without formal training before their first school enrollment, quickly catch up academically and often pass their more school experienced peers, and the late starters generally excel in behavior, sociality, and leadership. And that's a good point to pause on there. Academic success can be helpful, but there are more important things than that, aren't there? Behavior, social skills, leadership skills, these are vital. And the research is finding that those who start later typically do better in those things. But I still hear the question, you're going, okay, yeah, I'm convinced on that, but how are they actually going to catch up? Good question, glad you asked. The research shows if the brain is ready for it, all of the learning necessary for success in high school can be accomplished in only 2 or 3 years of formal skill study. 2 or 3 years. Let me give an example how this works. Now, I'm not actually saying this is what is taught in each grade, but I'm giving a hypothetical scenario as an illustration of how curriculum works today and how the school system functions and how we could do better. But imagine first grade, we begin teaching addition. And we have the addition of ones. And so we have numbers like 3 plus 5. Well, they're not quite ready for it. They're struggling to understand it. The brain routes the thinking through the incorrect thinking center, as we talked about, the lower thinking centers. And so we have to do a lot of repetition because they don't understand the concept, right? You ask them, do 3 plus 5 on paper. They can do that. Anyone have the answer, by the way? 8. Okay, thank you. And so you ask them to do that on paper. They can do it. But if you ask them, okay, you have 3 loaves of bread on the counter. Let's make 5 more loaves of bread. How many are we going to have? They'll be like, I'm not really sure. Because they don't understand the concept. Learning it on paper is totally different from understanding the concept. The only way they're going to get that concept is doing it in everyday life. That's what should be done in the early age. But anyway, we start at first grade. We do lots of repetition because we have to drill it into the brain. And so we repeat. Finally, the end of first grade rolls around and they've got that. So second grade comes along. What are we going to do? We're going to make it a little more difficult, right? That's how curriculum works. You learn the same subject every year, but you just make it a little more difficult. That's called the spiral approach. And I realize these aren't the actual things you're learning in each grade. I'm just illustrating how curriculum works. So again, you have to do a lot more repetition. They finally get to understanding how to add tens. Anyone have the answer on this one? 30, okay. Now, third grade comes along. What are we going to do? We're going to make it a little more difficult this year. We're going to review the past 2 years because they've forgotten everything during summer break. And now we're going to repeat, lots more repetition. Finally, they're learning how to add hundreds. Anyone got this one added up? All righty. Now, fourth grade rolls around. What are we going to do? Make it a little more harder. Repeat the previous 3 years. Repeat, 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 repeat. Lots of examples. Drill it into the brain. I see the wheels turning. All right. 35, 25, 92. That was close. You get the principle though, right? This is called the spiral approach. This is the opposite of what is called mastery learning, where you understand the concept, you really know what it means, and you can apply it in any situation. The spiral approach just increases the level of difficulty year after year after year, and you just keep repeating the same subjects. So it took you 4 years to finally get to addition of thousands. Let's suppose a different method. Let's suppose that as the child is at the age of first grade, you start learning some addition while you're, working in the garden, adding some vegetables together, or working in the kitchen. Is there math to learn in the kitchen? Plenty of that. And so they start to understand conceptually what addition means. They might not do it on paper. They might not understand how to do that, but they understand the meaning of it. And as they grow, as they advance, you start understanding how to add things together. And so by the time third or fourth grade rolls around, you're like, okay, let's take the concept that you already know in your mind, and let's apply this on paper. How long would it take you to teach a fourth grader to add 3 plus 5 on paper? Like 5 minutes, right? Pretty easy to teach. Okay, yeah, you understand how to add that. You already know what it means in your mind. Now you're just going to do it on paper. So then when you add tens and you make it 14 plus 16, here's how that works. When you make it hundreds, here's how that works. When you do thousands, here's how that works. In a half hour or an hour, you could teach a child who had been learning these things in practical life how to transfer that knowledge to paper. And you just saved yourself 4 years of drill. This is what we mean by catching up. It's not that they're going to, wait till they get to 8 to 10 and we're going to cram it in for 14 hours a day and bring them up to speed. No, you're learning through everyday life, and then you're learning conceptually. You're focusing, of course, we're going to get to that as we finish up, but you want to focus on spiritual development, character development, those important things. But as part of everyday life, you're learning some academic skills, and then one day you just start transferring it to paper. And in my experience, in the studies that I've done, we're talking just a few weeks, and they're caught up completely with their grade. Which, the grade is such an arbitrary number anyway, right? It's just a worldly system. But anyway, it's the one we're working with. Let me just share a little story on this. I was, also when I was in Tanzania, actually, I was sharing on this topic, and I finished up, and I said, does anyone have any questions on the topic? Anything to talk about? And the principal of the school raised his hand. He said, well, I don't really have a question. I just thought maybe I'd share my experience. You see, I was a herds boy. I took care of my family's cows until I was 13 years old. And I finally convinced my father to let me go to school. And I went to school, and I learned to read in a couple of days. I said, a couple of days, you learned to read? He goes, yeah, it was easy. No problem. I'm thinking, wow, this guy's just really smart, He said, in about a week or two, I had caught up with my class level, the grade level that I would have been at had I been in school all along. A few months later, it was time to take the national exams. And my teacher's like, you've only been here a couple months, maybe wait till next year. He goes, oh, school's been easy so far, let me give it a try. He scored top of the school, better than everyone else. And I'm thinking, wow, this guy's, obviously quite talented, quite a genius. I said, thank you. That's a really interesting story. Now, do we have any questions? One of the teachers raised his hand. He said, well, I was a herds boy also. I didn't really have a question, just maybe thought I'd share my experience. And I took care of my father's cows until I was 12 and finally went to school. And I learned to read in about a week, caught up with my class level in a couple of weeks, took the national exams a couple of months later and scored almost the top of the school. I said, wow, we got two geniuses here. It wasn't quite sinking into my mind yet. I said, thank you. That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Do we have any questions? Another teacher raised his hand. Well, I didn't really have a question. Thought maybe I'd share my experience. I was a herds boy too, and I took care of my father's cows until I was about 12, convinced him to let me go to school and learn to read in a week, and yeah, you know the story. And then the next one raised his hand, and the next one raised his hand. It was just normal to them, especially for a firstborn of the family, to take care of the family's cows until a younger sibling grew up, and then he could go to school, and he would catch right up and do very well in the academic subjects, having no previous training in academics. Now, obviously, like I said, we can learn a lot of those academic skills through everyday life, and that's a good thing to do. But even here, we have an example. They were unwittingly following God's plan, living that natural lifestyle, spending time outdoors, involved in agriculture, physical activity, all these things. It was strengthening their mind. So when the time came they went to school, it was no problem for them. And I'm sure they learned some math taking care of the cows too, right? And just one other experience that was particularly striking, some friends of ours, they were Brazilian, and they were living in the U.S. This has been a few years ago, and it came time that through some changes that were happening in their life, they needed to move back to Brazil. Now, they had been homeschooling their children in the U.S. and in Brazil, but in the U.S. also. But in Brazil, the restrictions are a lot more than here in the U.S., and you have to have everything super documented. But this mother in the U.S., had been doing very little documentation. They were just learning through everyday life. Sometimes they'd get to the books, sometimes they wouldn't. And she said when we were going back to Brazil, it was just filling her with terror, because she's like, great, now I have to have documentation for everything. And she said the last, and her son was 12, was it? 11, 12? Yeah, 12, I think. So he should have been in like 5th or 6th grade. She said the last complete grade we finished, according to any curriculum, was grade 2. She said, we'd just been learning through everyday life and getting a book occasionally and learning from that. We weren't going through this grade by grade curriculum. She said, so going back to Brazil, I'm like, what am I going to do? She was feeling like a bad mom, not properly educating her child. So she found a series of tests that her son could take that would measure his grade level in different subjects. And she said that will allow us to go back to Brazil and say he's at this grade in this subject, this grade in that subject, and go from there. And so I know this is falling off. She got the tests, and she told her son, I think there were like 10 subjects or something like that. It was a pretty advanced assessment. And she told her son, look, take these one at a time. It was on the computer. And then, go outside, get some fresh air and exercise, come back in. I want your brain to be as fresh as it can be, so you do as the best you can on these tests. Well, he was just gung-ho ready to go, all excited about it. He sat down and knocked the whole thing out in one gulp, all the subjects. And finished up. It took him several hours. He finished up late in the evening, and she is just like, this is hopeless. These are going to be terrible. And, he didn't really care much about the scores, and she just like, this is not a good situation. It's going to really make me look like a bad mom. Anyway, she waited for the results to come back. Finally got the results and open up the scores, and she's looking for, F, 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 fail on everything, or maybe a really low grade. Remember, the last grade he'd completed officially was grade 2. The lowest grade she could find was grade 8. She's like, something is wrong here. What is going on? Grade 8, grade 10, grade 11, grade 12, his English. Now, English was not their second language. I mean, English was their second language in their home, wasn't their first language. English was grade 11. And she's like, this is crazy. But then there were a couple of subjects that were listed as PHS. And she thought, aha, those are the ones he failed on. But she's like, what is PHS supposed to mean? Looks back in the legend at the end of the book, PHS, post-high school. And her son goes, well, what's that supposed to mean, Mom? She goes, I guess it means you're done with school. And so, God's methods work. God has said, follow my ways, and I will honor those who honor me. I'm not suggesting that every child is going to be this genius and score through the roof with all the academic skills if we follow this method. That's not what God has said, because the academics are not our highest priority. But it is a nice side effect that when we follow God's method, the mind is so strong that they typically do very well in the academics. And so our final point is really the most important one, and that is spirituality and spiritual strength. None of this makes any difference or is really important unless we're focused on the character development of our children. And we know that the early years of childhood are important for the development of spirituality, cause to effect reasoning, emotion, relationships, behavior management, language, memory skills, moral understanding, conscience, and character development. Is this an important list? This is just vital, right? This is what we really should be caring about as Christian parents. All of these functions, the foundation is laid in the first 7 years of a child's life in the brain. And I have to imagine, Satan understands this very well, doesn't he? And he says, what can I do to make it so parents don't focus on what really matters in the early years of life? And he's got our minds twisted around. He's got a society and systems of schooling and government and all these different things. It's the world we live in that has conditioned us to believe that we've got to give them the flashcards when they're young. We've got to start with baby Einstein. We've got to get them in kindergarten. What grade are they in? Give them that head start in the academics. That's just as Satan would have it, because he's distracting us from what really matters in the early years of life. He knows full well that those academics can be learned later, and they'll actually be better learned later. He doesn't really care, though. He just wants something to distract parents from the most important thing. We know that the early years are a critical period for the areas of the brain that lay the foundation for spiritual strength. And if we are pressuring in the academics, it actually suppresses spiritual development. The Spirit of Prophecy was very clear on this, though. As it says, parents, especially mothers, should be the only teachers of such infant minds. And you say, okay, this is referring to infant, of course. If you look in the context here, I believe it's the paragraph or two before this, it defines what infancy is. It says infancy extends from birth through, not unto, but through age 7. So when does infancy end? Age 8, right? When 7 ends. It says through age 7, so age 8. So parents, especially mothers, should be the only teachers of children through age 7 until they reach age 8. Now, of course, beyond that is great too, but especially then. And then it says, they should not educate from books. It's so plain, right? We see from the research the reasons why, but the books should not be our focus, right here from the Spirit of Prophecy. So what should we do instead? We saw the textbook should be nature, the classroom should be outdoors. It explains here what to do. So that the children generally will be inquisitive to learn the things of nature. Now that's assuming they're out in nature, right? Children aren't going to be asking questions about things that are not surrounding them. So you need to put them out in nature. They will ask questions in regard to the things they see and hear. God knew something about children, didn't he? Asking questions. And parents should improve the opportunity to instruct and patiently answer these little inquiries. And what will be the result? It's the same thing we talked about in the message this morning, spiritual strength. Listen to this. They can, in this manner, get the advantage of the enemy. Who wants the advantage of the enemy, friends? Don't we all? They can, in this manner, get the advantage of the enemy and fortify the minds of their children by sowing good seed in their hearts, leaving no room for the bad to take root. The mother's loving instructions at a tender age is what is needed by children in the formation of character. And this is a biblical principle. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 says, to everything there's a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. God has a schedule. It shouldn't surprise us that there's a schedule of development that God has given us. Education tells us true education is not the forcing of instruction on an unready and unreceptive mind. The mental powers must be awakened, the interest aroused. Jesus talked about this when he says, first the blade, then the ear, after that the full corn in the ear. Ellen White expounds on this, and she says, the gradual development of the plant from the seed is an object lesson in child training. He who gave this parable created the tiny seed, gave it its vital properties, and ordained the laws that govern its growth. The little one should be educated in childlike simplicity. Childhood answers to the blade in the parable, and the blade has a beauty peculiarly its own. Children should not be forced into a precocious maturity, but as long as possible should retain the freshness and grace of their early years. How many here has ever grown any corn? Anyone? Okay, a few of us grown some corn. Now imagine you planted some corn, and you went out a week or 10 days later, and you checked on your corn, and you see some little plants coming up. What do you do at that point? Man, I wanted corn. What is going on? Is that what you do? No, you're like, I have corn. And somebody be looking at you, go, what are you talking about? You don't have corn, you have plants coming up. And you're like, no, I have the promise of corn. I know it will be corn. You recognize the beauty in those little plants coming up. Same in childhood. Why do we pressure them to do things that is not for their period of time, is not for their stage of development? God says focus on character development at an early age. Let the academic stuff come later. And we say, no, I want to hurry it along. And so we bend down and we grab that little corn plant and we pull it along. And we end up just damaging it for all the rest of its life. We started with this, and we'll end with it. Parents should be the only teachers of their children until they have reached 8 or 10 years of age. As fast as their minds can comprehend it, the parents should open before them God's great book of nature. The only schoolroom for children until 8 or 10 years of age should be in the open air, amid the opening flowers and nature's beautiful scenery, and their most familiar textbook, The Treasures of Nature. I started with this, and I asked the question, I just kind of stated, we've looked at this and we've said, well, that's a little old-fashioned, maybe it doesn't apply anymore. Have we seen that it applies today? Have we seen that it applies more than ever today? The world is catching up with us, friends. God has called us, though, to be the head and not the tail. We look at this and we say, and when we see the research from the world, we say, oh, maybe we should have listened to that. But how many things has the Lord given us instruction about that the world hasn't found reasons for yet? Are we going to wait for the world to prove God right? Or are we going to step out in faith, trust what He has told us, and obey, knowing it will make us the head and not the tail? Friends, we have so much counsel. The spirit of prophecy is so full of instruction to us. Let's read it. Let's obey it. Let's trust that it is right and not have to depend on the world to make us go, oh yeah, probably we should do that. No, let's trust God knows what He's talking about. Amen? All right, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll take a break. Father in heaven, thank you for this instruction to us. How blessed we are to have all this research. But Lord, forgive us for distrusting it at times. Help us to obey. Help us to apply these things into our lives. And in all areas of our lives, help us to trust in your counsel and obey it even when we don't understand all the way. We thank you and we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.